Now, everybody's big question after the Mexican Grand Prix was, did Mercedes throw away a potential race win for Lewis Hamilton? You could have just hopped on Twitter and you would have found about 44,000 accounts with a PhD in race strategy. We can watch this video here. We're going to break down the race and use actual data to understand the what if and what could have been of the 2022 Mexico Grand Prix. If you've been following the last few races, I think you'll agree with me that Mercedes are finally appearing to recover. What they still lack in single lap pace, they appear to be getting much closer to the front in race pace. Now, Ferrari really didn't even feature in this race. It looks like they had all sorts of issues. Where to start? Their straight line performance was very poor this weekend. It looks like they had to reduce the boost pressure because their turbo really couldn't keep up with the ambient pressure. They also seemed to struggle with the high speed balance all weekend and in the race. They were just nowhere. So we're not even really going to talk about them. But in this video, I'm going to focus on the Red Bull and the Mercedes pace and answer your questions. Now, the biggest question, did Mercedes make a massive error in their strategy? Now, one thing you should never do is pay too much attention to free practice 3. This is often a throwaway session riddled with last-minute tests, scrappy runs, traffic, and in Mercedes' case, were they doing a little bit of showboating? But in FP3, they managed a 118.4, which nobody even got close to until the second round of qualifying. But anyway, so let's quickly look at some Mercedes performance trends over the season and try to see what we can understand. Now, to keep this simple, I'm just going to focus on qualifying pace. Now, this graph here is the gap to pole position in terms of percent lap time for the dry qualifying sessions of this season. Anything further away than about 0.5%, and this puts you closer to the midfield than the front. Now, you can see since the break, Mercedes have been pretty inconsistent in qualifying, but there's actually a very clear trend. On the low downforce circuits like Spa and Monza, Mercedes struggles quite a bit. Top speed is not the Mercedes W13's jam, but this car does come alive on the higher downforce circuits. You can see at the Dutch, the Singapore, the US, and the Mexico Grand Prix, their qualifying gaps to pole were reasonable, even setting pole in Hungary before the break, which is another high downforce circuit. So, as far as the rest of the season, I think at Brazil they should be somewhat competitive, and at Abu Dhabi, we'll just have to see. Now, as far as race pace goes, they have become more competitive on the high downforce circuits, and they're closing the gap to the front. For whatever reason, Ferrari's lack of pace has enabled them to take even more points away in the recent races as well, but for now, it's time to focus on Mexico. Let's jump straight into the data. It's time to get a little bit nerdy, but don't worry, I'll explain everything as we go. Now, I'm going to first set the stage, trying to understand what kind of discussions the teams are having Sunday morning in their strategy briefings. So let's look back to free practice 1. FP1 was a scrappy session on a dirty track with lots of test drivers in the cars. When I went back and looked at the data, nobody had really run any meaningful duration on a hard tire. You can see Sargent's doing a bit of hard running here, but they're not doing anything more than 5, 6, maybe 7 laps on these hard tires. Hamilton ran the hard tire for a couple of laps and then jumped straight onto the soft tire. To be fair, most of the teams did have a little look at the hard tire, but there's not really anything meaningful from a strategy data gathering point of view. Now, fast forward to FP2, which is usually where you gather most of your data. FP2 was a Pirelli test session. This looked like a bigger disaster than the FP2 tire test in Austin. So knowing what this session was, I didn't even bother watching it. And I can almost guarantee you that the teams learned absolutely nothing from this session. Also, as I was writing this script, Pirelli have already scrapped their plans to reduce the tire blanket temperatures further for next year due to not enough information and no confidence going into it. So take that what you will. With limited running in FP2, FP3 is simply a dress rehearsal for qualifying. The teams were just focused on the soft and medium tire performance. So we're struggling for useful tire data this weekend. What do the teams do? Now, the teams can lean heavily on data that they've gathered earlier in the season. Every time the car goes on a track during a race, you are gathering data on a tire, but there is no substitute for gathering data on a possible race tire on the circuit you're about to race at. So that means that the level of confidence in the hard tire performance here in Mexico City is probably very low. Now, to put this in perspective, the race is 71 laps. If you do a one stop, you're looking at 30 to 40 laps on a single tire. In free practice, we've barely done more than 10 laps. So as a strategist, you're definitely reaching on this event quite a bit and leaning on trends and statistics from other tracks. In my opinion, less practice actually makes better racing, or at least it adds to the uncertainty. Unfortunately, no level of uncertainty was going to make this race, as a viewer, very interesting at all. To be fair though, I did have an awesome time watching the race over on Twitch with the rest of the community. If you feel like checking it out, I'm live for every qualifying and race session, and I just try to give you guys a little bit more insight into what's actually going on during the race, and I'll leave the link below in the description. So speaking of strategy, let's have a look at what Pirelli have projected for this weekend. So the fastest strategy on Pirelli's predictions is a 2-stop, a soft, medium, medium, with the next best being a hard to medium 1-stop. The soft medium 1-stop does not even feature on their suggestions, and the medium soft 1-stop here is Pirelli's slower option. So if you watch the race, you will understand that Pirelli had different numbers to quite a few teams. We have basically no useful practice data, some strategy suggestions, and a metric fuck ton of uncertainty going into the race. It's now time to dig into what actually happened and what could have been. So there is actually a lot going on during this race, sort of, but I want to focus on Hamilton and Verstappen's race because I think that's the most interesting bit. We're going to try to understand what happened, and we're going to answer that question. Could Mercedes have won this race? Now, I'm not sure yet, so let's talk through it. On the grid, the blankets come off and we see the Red Bull on soft and the Mercedes on medium tires. At this point, people are thinking Mercedes are almost certainly on a 1-stop. Meanwhile, the Red Bulls are looking at maybe a soft medium 2-stop strategy. Now, the track temperature is around 45 degrees Celsius, and the soft compound might struggle a little bit with overheating, while the medium tire might be a little bit more comfortable here. So here is the first stint race gaps plot. This chart basically just shows us the lap number and the distance between any two drivers on the track. Right here, I've highlighted Hamilton and Verstappen. Now, the first stint is just a procession. Verstappen's able to keep Hamilton out of his DRS range, so outside of 1 second, and he just kind of does his own thing as long as he can. Now, we can see Verstappen pits here before Hamilton, while Hamilton extends his stint a bit further. But if we look at the actual lap times that the drivers are doing on these stints, we get a little bit more of an understanding of what's actually going on. For the most part, Max and Lewis are matching lap times throughout the stint. Now, around lap 13, you can see Lewis puts the hammer down here a little bit, but he can't really keep that pace up and he drops his pace back just a little bit. Maybe he had a little bit of overheating, or maybe he realized he wasn't going to actually be able to close that gap. He settles down, conserves his tires for a little bit. He knows he's playing the long game here, so it's not a big deal. Max also has to respond here by increasing his pace to keep Lewis out of the DRS. But then this is where we start to see Verstappen struggling with the softs. You can see a gradual loss of pace here for Verstappen. So Verstappen's on the radio with his engineer. He's not very happy. His engineer is quite aware they're getting into a bit of degradation. The lap times get worse, and then Max pits here. Lewis gets his head down and pushes for a few more laps before he pits on lap 30. So far, we can kind of conclude a few things. Mercedes can match the Red Bull pace on 1-step harder tire. The medium, as expected, is a more robust tire for these track conditions. The track's pretty warm. At this point, Mercedes probably thinking they might have a chance at the 1-stop, it should be easy, and they're probably thinking the Red Bull's converting to a 2-stop. Verstappen did 24 laps out of a 71-lap race on the soft tire. He will need to double that distance on a medium to pull off the 1-stop. A few things are happening in the background at this point, and they are going to impact both the Red Bull and the Mercedes race in a significant way. So let's look at what happened around the pit stop sequence. Immediately, I noticed that there's one thing that has had actually a reasonable impact on the viability of Lewis's second stint. Now, when Lewis finishes the first lap of his second stint, you notice that he's gone from about 2 seconds behind Verstappen to about 6 seconds or more behind Verstappen. So what happened? Well, it really looks like a combination of a few things. So after Max pits for new mediums, he's going about 3/4 of a second faster than Lewis over 3 to 4 laps. So that's 2 to 3 seconds, right? In laps, all laps are equal in races, including the in lap. So there was only a few tenths of difference between them, so that's not a big factor. Now, here's the big one, number 3. Outlaps are very important in races. And here's the big problem. The hard was always going to struggle with warm-up relative to the medium. Verstappen found 1.7 seconds on the outlap over Hamilton, and most of that was in sector 1, so I think that's warm-up. In summary, you've got pit loss and you've got warm-up, and the softer tire was favored here. Now, I know that everybody wants to get to the what-if section where we look at what happened if Mercedes had matched Red Bull's strategy, but there's one very, very important piece of the puzzle that we need to identify that we've been talking about, so let's get into it. Now, by the end of the race, Verstappen has pulled a 15-second gap to Lewis, but there are actually a lot of very interesting radio messages between Max and his engineer, which are kind of the same conversations that Lewis is having with his race engineer, but in different words. So let me explain what I mean. First, we need to have a look at the lap times between Hamilton on the hard and Verstappen on the medium. Now, Verstappen seems very consistent in his lap times, but Hamilton's lap times are quite a bit more variable on this stint. Now, yes, both of the drivers are coming through backmarker traffic and having to overtake, and that will have impacts on their lap times, but Lewis appears to be struggling with his tire. My conclusion is the hard just does not have enough grip in these conditions, and I have a few ideas as to why that is, but let's talk about tire management for just a second. If you listened to the driver's radio, you heard quite a few discussions between Max and his race engineer GP about tire management. They talked about braking points, they talked about brake balance settings, and they also talked about lift and coast. Lifting and coasting at the end of a long straight is a great way to save fuel without losing much lap time. Actually underfueling the car and doing small amounts of lift and coast is the actual fastest way to the end of a race. I'll explain that in another video. But it's also a great way to reduce tire temperatures. Now, from their radio messages, the team was happy with the fuel targets, and at this point, Max was instructed that he was free to push and he could minimize liftoff. This tells me that the Red Bull was almost too cold on the medium tire, and this raises an interesting point and a very interesting question. So if Red Bull were too cool on the mediums, it's very likely that Mercedes were in an even worse situation on the hard tire. But why didn't Mercedes have the same issue on the medium tire in the first stint? Well, this could be a factor. The track temperature at the start of the race was about 49 degrees at the peak and on average about 45. Now, the track temperature at the start of the race was as high as 49 degrees Celsius and on average it was about 45. But throughout the race, the track temperature was dropping and it finished the race around 38-37 degrees. Now, a few degrees of track temperature could make a big impact on tire performance. Additionally, the cars are getting lighter throughout the race, so there's less energy in the brakes, less energy in the tires, and less temperature overall. Remember, Mercedes is on the hard tire. The hard tire is a higher working range tire. That simply means that the compound produces its peak grip at a higher temperature. That leads me to believe that the track temperature was cooling and the hard tire was actually dropping further out of its ideal operating window. But we've still got some questions to answer. So it's time to talk about the what ifs and the what could have beens of the Mexican Grand Prix. But there's a few things that we need to establish first to set a little bit of context. It's not clear to me at all if before the race, Red Bull knew it was going to be a one-stop. Converting from a one-stop soft medium to a two-stop soft medium medium early enough might not have been a disaster, honestly. Strategy is one of those things where everybody and their uncle on Twitter thinks it's this exact science, and if you get it wrong, you're an idiot. It's not the case. There is so much uncertainty around race strategy, and there's so many variables that teams struggle to make objective assessments on. Yes, there's a lot of science, numbers, statistics, but there's so much more. I do not think that Mercedes felt like the soft medium was viable. Otherwise, I think they would have done it. I think they were concerned about wear life. But at the same time, I think everybody's lack of experience on the hard tire made the medium hard one stop a risk as well. Or at least it added another level of uncertainty. So we've got scenario one. Mercedes takes the same strategy as Red Bull, the one stop soft medium. Now, there's nothing to tell me that the Mercedes struggled with tire wear or deg any more than the Red Bull. So Mercedes' race pace was good, and they were able to match Red Bull on a step harder compound in the first stint. If they had matched strategies, I feel like we would have seen a much closer race between the two. Now, the top speed disadvantage of the W13 would have made overtaking a little bit more difficult, but not impossible. Also, being able to push up closer to Max and put him under a little bit of pressure on his first stint could have massively shortened his tire performance life, and then forcing Red Bull onto either a two-stop or a suboptimal one-stop strategy. Arguably, if Lewis had done that, the same would have happened to his tire performance life as well. So honestly, matching Red Bull's strategy was probably the best one if they could have made the tires work in the same way. I think it's possible, but there's a second scenario, which is for some of the connoisseurs of Twitter. So let's see what this scenario looks like. So here is my scenario 2. What if Lewis had tried a Danny Rick? No, I'm not talking about punting Tsunoda into the shadow realm, not that part. I'm talking about the medium soft one-stopper. So several drivers all tried the medium soft one-stop, but it really only seems like Ricciardo made this strategy look good. So let's have a look at it. So here's a simple way to think about Lewis on a medium soft one-stop strategy. For every lap that Lewis stayed out on the medium in the first stint, Max was gaining about 0.75 seconds per lap on a new medium tire. Max's lap times were insanely consistent during the second stint. I mean, look at this. Every single lap that Max did was in the 1-minute 22s. So, I mean, super consistent on that medium tire. So let's do some quick numbers. We've got Verstappen pitting here on lap 24. If Lewis wanted to make the one-stop work, he would have had to pit probably on the same lap as Ricciardo, which is lap 44 here. If Lewis had stayed out to do this stint, he would have probably run into similar degradation as Russell, and I reckon Lewis would have been crossing Verstappen here, by which point he would have pit for the soft tire. At this point, he falls 20 seconds behind Max. From here, there are 27 laps left in the race. In order to catch Max, Lewis would have needed to outpace the race leader by 0.75 seconds per lap, while being let past his teammate, overtaking Perez, and then finally overtaking Verstappen. Now, there is a possibility the soft tire could have managed, but it already seemed on the edge during stint 1 after 25 laps for Max, and he really didn't have to do any overtaking. He was just kind of managing that tire. I really don't think Mercedes wanted to risk this, but then again, Ferrari were absolutely nowhere. Was it really going to be a risk? Now, with perfect hindsight, it's very easy to say that the Mercedes strategy was the wrong one. But in Mexico, I don't think Mercedes actually had a beat Red Bull strategy in their pocket. Before the race, nobody was 100% certain that a one-stop soft medium was going to work. By starting on the mediums, yes, Mercedes did hedge their bets on the one-stop, but that's history. Sometimes you've got to do different to the other team and see what happens. Now Mercedes is closing the gap to the front, but they're not quite there yet. That being said, their development throughout the season has been very impressive considering where they started. Now, Brazil is another high altitude circuit, but it's not quite as high as Mexico City, so let's see if the Mercedes W13's recent form carries on. I don't think the Mercedes will be as close as they were in Mexico, considering Interlagos is not a max downforce circuit, but let's see. Now, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you're still watching at this point, I've left a few other videos that you will enjoy here in the cards. I'll see you next time.